Conference webinar exploring state strategies for using education as a tool for rural development. This webinar is a joint project of the SLC Education Committee and the SLC Agricultural and Rural Development Committee. My name is Miko Lindberg, and I am the Education Policy Analyst with the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments. I'm joined by my colleague Lauren Greer, who is the Policy Analyst for Agricultural and Rural Development. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we begin, let me mention that you are in listen-only mode. However, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the question box on the GoToWebinar toolbar. You may do so at any time during the webinar. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible before the end of our program. Also note that we will be recording this event, and it will be available online at the CSG Knowledge Center at knowledgecenter.csg.org and on the SLC website at slcatlanta.org. Estimates from the U.S. Census Bureau indicate that between April 2010 and July 2012, non-metropolitan counties as a whole experienced a decrease in total population for the first time. What this statistic does not entail, however, is the long-term trend of youth immigration from these rural areas and what impact these population shifts have on the vitality of rural communities. In fact, rural communities in the South continue to face serious challenges in getting highly educated students to return home after college graduation. Research indicates that education may be a cause and effect for this rural brain drain phenomenon, and also the key to reversing the trend. Studies have shown that efforts to improve rural education contribute to rapid economic development in those areas, while a more educated community can serve as a catalyst for business expansion and increased civic engagement. This webinar will highlight the impact of education on rural development and examine initiatives in rural counties and communities to entice educated former residents to return and invest in their hometowns. We hope today's webinar will provide you with a better understanding of the connection between education and rural development and some ideas on how quality education can encourage growth in non-urban areas. With that, I'll turn it over to Lauren to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Miko. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Alex Murray, who is a research economist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. His principal areas of research center on the role of human capital in rural economies, and particularly as they pertain to educational attainment and migration decisions. Dr. Murray's work has appeared in several publications, including the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. He'll provide an overview of the link between education and rural development, and incorporating some ERS research, he'll discuss some of the trends in education, rural migration, and rural economic development. Our second speaker will be Dr. Brad Mitchell, who leads Battelle for Kids' efforts to build and leverage philanthropic resources and grants to fund innovative education reforms. He previously led the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, a partnership between Battelle for Kids and 21 school districts in Southeast Ohio, dedicated to developing a comprehensive approach to accelerating college and career readiness. He'll discuss some policy considerations and innovative strategies states can use for improving rural education and economic development. Our final speakers will be Mr. Drew Jacobs, who serves as the Director of Research and Data at the Tennessee-based State Collaborative on Reforming Education, also known as SCORE, and Dr. Nancy Dishner from the Niswonger Foundation. Some of the work under Mr. Jacobs' direction includes field research efforts, the annual SCORE Prize, and best practice sharing initiatives. He'll provide a state-level perspective by discussing some of the things happening in Tennessee with rural education and SCORE's rural roadmap for improving education. Dr. Dishner is the president and CEO of the Niswonger Foundation in Greeneville, Tennessee. Dr. Dishner retired from public education after 30 years of service in both K-12 and university settings. She will join Mr. Jacobs to discuss the work the Niswonger Foundation is doing in Northeast Tennessee. And finally, we'd like to thank Mary Cypress Metz from SCORE for her contribution to today's webinar. With that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Murray.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you again to all the panelists, the distinguished panelists who are speaking today. I'm very excited at this opportunity to share some of the research that we're doing at ERS on rural education and to learn from the other panelists and the participants in this webinar about education in the rural South in particular. As Lauren mentioned, I am focusing my presentation on trends in rural education and with a special focus on the rural South. And I'm also going to talk about the relationship between rural education and economic outcomes and population change, and discuss some of the relationship between those three different variables. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I work at ERS, which is an agency of about 300 people within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And our mission is to inform and enhance public and private decision-making on economic and policy issues related to ag, food, the environment, and rural development. So it's a fun place to work. We've got people working on issues diverse as forecasting farm income to international agricultural markets to rural development issues. In fact, the group I work in is about 15 people strong, and we do economic and social research on rural America, from things like poverty to farm income and to other issues that are important for rural America. Now, I have to give a quick plug for our website, ers.usda.gov. A lot of resources there, including all kinds of analysis and data. We have a magazine which is free and available to everybody called Amber Waves. We have more in-depth, in detail reports and publications as well. Two things I want to highlight that people might be interested in. We have an atlas of rural and small town America, which is an interactive mapping little piece of software which you can look at a whole host of economic and social indicators in your particular town or county or state. And we also have a series of charts called Chart of Note, which is tweeted out every day. You can also sign up to get it on your email, and it's really a nice way to sort of get a look at interesting charts that we've come across, and with a brief little blurb about why the information we're sharing is important and what it suggests for the future. So those two things may be of particular interest to the people on this webinar. Next slide, please. So in the interest of time, I'm going to breeze through a few slides so that we have time for questions and discussion. But first, I want to lay some groundwork by defining rurality, so sort of give you an idea of the rural definition that we use most often at ERS and most researchers in the rural development field use. Then I'm going to talk about trends in educational attainment, both in rural America as a whole and in the rural South. Next, I'm going to discuss education and economic outcomes, how those two things are related, both for rural people and for rural counties. And then briefly, I'm going to touch on the relationship between education and population change, especially looking at net migration. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of how we define rural areas, it's really a county-based system. And this is a table that shows the various codes we use. But the key thing to focus on is that this definition of rurality is based on two basic concepts, one population size and the other proximity. And this is the official definition used by the Office of Management and Budget, which is a federal agency. And after every decennial census, they look at the population figures and they classify metropolitan areas and assign the counties that metropolitan areas are in and identify those as metro counties. So anytime that I say urban in this presentation, I mean metro counties, and anytime I say non-metro, I mean rural. And as you'll see, non-metro is really just a residual. It's whatever counties are not identified as metropolitan counties. So that means that they're highly diverse. The key population figure separating metro counties from non-metro counties is 50,000. So if you have a county with an urban area with 50,000 people or more, then you're a metro county. If you're a county that has close commuting ties to an urban population in a metro county, then you're also considered a metro county. Non-metro counties don't meet that definition. They can be very diverse. So if you look at the first code under non-metro, there's urban population of 20,000 or more up to 49,999, all the way down to code 9, which is a county which is completely rural with a very small town of 2,500 people or less. So there's a great sort of diversity within non-metro rural America, which is sometimes hard to capture. Next slide, please. This is a map showing the non-metro and metro classification system based on the most recent release from the Office of Management and Budget that I spoke about earlier. It uses updated population counts from the 2010 census. And as you see, the counties are identified either as non-metro or metro. Most counties are considered rural in the United States, but the population size is quite small. I think it's about 17% of the U.S. population under this classification system is considered rural. So although the system is imperfect, it's really what's used for most of the research that we do, and the reason is availability of data. Economic data is most readily and frequently available at the county level, and that can create problems, especially for large counties. If you look, for example, at California, in the central region of California, the counties are quite large, and there are places within those counties which you and I might easily consider rural towns. But under this system, they are classified as metro because as you move closer to the coast, there are larger cities there, and thus the whole county gets classified as metro or urban. So it's an imperfect system, but it does a fairly good job of tying in with economic data and describing rural America. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to show you is some charts about trends in rural educational attainment. I'm just going to take a second here to explain this chart in detail because it's a pattern that will repeat. On the vertical axis is percent of the population, and here we're looking at the adult population 25 years of age and older. Most of the time in rural educational research for rural development, we're looking at people 25 years of age and older because we assume that the vast majority of people have already finished making their finished schooling, finished making their investments in college if they're going to do that. Now, to be sure, there's still people go back to college later on in life, but we're trying to capture the adult population that for the most part has finished their education. The horizontal axis shows you groupings based on highest level of educational attainment achieved. So on the left-hand side, you have less than high school diploma, moving to high school diploma or GED. The next category is some college or associate's degree. Now that category includes people who attended college of any kind and did not complete it. It also includes people who completed associate's degrees. It's sort of typical in this research to group those two together, although there are some interesting differences. And if you're interested in the data on broken down by associate's degree, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share that with you. And finally, the last category is bachelor's degree or higher. Now, the light blue bars show the percentage of the rural adult population that falls into each of those education categories. So for example, in 2000, 24% of rural adults had not completed a high school diploma or equivalent, such as a GED. The dark blue bar shows sort of an update with the most recent data, which is from 2013. And it shows over time the changing educational composition of the rural population. I think there are really two major takeaways from this chart, one which is pretty easy to see and the other which is a little bit hidden. The first is that rural places have really made great gains in educating people. the large decline over the 2000s in people without a high school diploma, and increases in both the some college associate's degree category and the bachelor's degree or higher category. However, when you do the same breakdown for urban areas, it's a little more stark. For example, it's not on the screen, but in 2013, 32% of the urban population had a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with 18% for rural areas. And furthermore, over the 2000s, urban areas grew their people with college degrees by 6 percentage points, while rural areas only grew by 3 percentage points. And I really think what's lacking at the national level is research on what's driving this. There are a number of factors. One could be that rural families have lower incomes than urban families, and so college is relatively more expensive to them. Another explanation has been that the geographic distance between rural families and colleges and universities adds an additional cost and degree of unfamiliarity to them. So there are a variety of issues that need more research. Next slide, please. Now this is the same chart, but what I've done is looked only at the rural counties that are in the South. And by South, I'm using SLC's definition. Now, in order to do a geography, custom geography aggregation, I have to use the 2009 to 2013 5-year average data. The Census Bureau only offers this kind of data at the county level, averaged over five-year periods after 2005. So it's a little less precise, but it did allow me to create this breakdown by rural and urban in SLC's South category. Now again, with this chart, you see the same picture as non-metro rural counties overall in the country, which is rising educational attainment. In fact, the percentage point differences in the gains within each category are about the same. So rural areas in the South appear to be improving their educational composition over the 2000s at about the same rate as rural counties overall in the U.S. However, the big difference is that in 2000, the educational composition of the rural South was much different than the educational composition of the rural counties overall in the United States. Just as an example, what we saw from the previous slide was that in 2000, 24% of adults had less than a high school diploma. In the South, that was 30%. So while the changes have been about the same in the South with the other rural counties across the country, we're sort of starting from a harder position with more work to do in terms of increasing educational attainment. Next slide, please. This slide shows education and unemployment rates for the rural population from 2007 to 2014. And in contrast with the previous slide, this again moves back to all rural counties. So here I'm looking at all rural counties between 2007 and 2014. The labor market data on unemployment rates is a little bit more up to date than the data on educational attainment. So as you can see, the vertical axis is unemployment rates, and the horizontal axis is a time scale. And as the different colored lines, as you move down, you sort of move up in educational attainment. So the first thing that you can see from this is that unemployment rates rise as you become less educated. So rural people with less than a high school diploma have very high unemployment rates compared to rural people with an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or higher level of educational attainment. The other thing that I think is interesting to take from this chart is you can see the effect of the recession, which began in December of 2007 and officially ended in 2009 at the national level. And what you can see is what happened with unemployment rates. People who were less educated in rural areas really got hammered in the recession. They were much more likely to lose their jobs than people with more educational attainment. But we're beginning to see in the recovery period, the so-called recovery period, a declining unemployment rates across all categories, but the steepest decline looks like it's been for people with less than a high school diploma, although it's still quite high compared to the other levels of educational attainment. I think one thing we're seeing is sort of a reversion to quote-unquote normal conditions that we saw prior to the Great Recession. The next slide, please. Okay, what I wanted to do was show you a similar sort of picture, unemployment rates, but for the rural South. And that's a little bit more complicated because, again, I had to create the SLC's South category. And so when I do that, again, I have to use the 5-year average data. So instead of lines here with nice, neat unemployment rates for each year, we've got bars, which are basically, which are average unemployment rates across each 5-year time span. In this case, it's 2006 to 2010 and 2009 to 2013. So it's sort of an imperfect look, but as precise as we can be with it, it looks like unemployment rates in the rural South by educational attainment are relatively similar to other rural areas across the country. And again, you see the same period, the same pattern, excuse me, of higher unemployment rates as you move down the educational attainment spectrum. Next slide, please. The next thing I wanted to show people was median earnings for rural people in the South. And again, I wanted to use SLC's definition, but of course, since we're looking at medians rather than counts or rates, I wasn't able to do a nice aggregation, custom aggregation. So instead, I had to use the Census Bureau's definition of the South, which differs from SLC's in some important ways. The Census Bureau's category includes Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, in contrast to SLC, and excludes Missouri, and I think Missouri is included in SLC's South definition. In the Census Bureau, Missouri is allocated to the Midwest. So if we were looking at the Census Bureau's definition for the South, it would look pretty different from SLC's if we were including metro areas, because then we would, of course, be getting the metropolitan DC area, which can be quite a bit different from other places in the rural South. But again, we're only looking at rural counties in Delaware and Maryland, and the District of Columbia is not rural, so it's not included in this next chart. Can I see the next slide, please? Okay, so this is showing median earnings based on your level of educational attainment. The data is from 2013, and it includes all adults ages 25 and older in the rural South who have any earnings at all. So that includes part-time workers and all workers, full-time, full-year workers. So everybody's sort of thrown into the pot. So take that with a grain of salt as you look at these figures, that if you looked at full-time, full-year workers, then it would probably inflate these numbers a bit, since included in here are part-time workers as well. But here the first, let's see, 5 categories as you move from the top down are educational attainment categories that we've seen before. And then at the bottom is all workers, so everybody's in the pot. The red bar is the Metro South, and the blue bar is the non-Metro South. And there are a few takeaways from this. First of all, sort of the clear pattern is that there's sizable gains both in rural areas and urban areas in the South to getting educational attainment, moving up that scale. The second thing to notice is that across all the categories, earnings are higher in urban areas, and that's true across the country as well. In fact, I repeated this chart for the whole country too, and it's about the same pattern emerges. The difference, though, is that between the gap in median earnings between metro and non-metro really depends on what level of education you have. So if you don't have a high school diploma, it looks like your median earnings in the rural South are about $18,900, and in the urban South it would be about $20,000. But if you go all the way up to people with bachelor's degrees, there's a much higher incentive to live and work in urban areas, at least from the perspective of earnings. So I think what this means for rural communities is that they're always going to face an especially high problem, or a big problem, with retaining people with college degrees, especially in rural areas. And so they need to find ways to attract people in, and some of that may be using the natural amenities in the place. It may be the quality of the schools. There are all kinds of, I'm very anxious to hear from other researchers their ideas about this, but the key takeaway here is that there's a sizable incentive to leave rural communities, especially for the most highly educated people. The next slide, please. The next few slides are going to focus on counties rather than people. So I've been looking at the previous charts, I've been looking at rural people, and the next few are going to look at rural counties and see how education is related to economic outcomes for those counties. Real quickly, what I've done here is use a classification system to identify counties across the country that have particularly low levels of educational attainment. So here I'm looking at the educational composition of each category, of each county, and the key variable that I'm looking at in particular is the percent of the adult population that has not completed a high school diploma. So what I did was identify these counties. These are counties where 20% or more of that population has less than a high school diploma or equivalent in 2008 to 2012. And if there are some statistics junkies in the audience today, these counties are one standard deviation away from the mean of percent less than high school diploma. So these really identify the places that have a lot of people with less than a high school diploma. Next slide, please. What that classification allows me to do is identify the so-called low education counties in the South versus all other rural counties in the South. So the red bars here represent rural counties with low educational attainment, and the black bar is all other rural counties in the South. And here I'm looking at three particular indicators that are really important for counties: poverty rates, child poverty rates, and unemployment rates. And I think what this chart shows is that the low education rural counties in the South face some pretty stiff winds here on these three fronts. Poverty rates are about 5 percentage points higher than other rural counties in the South, 8 percentage points higher for child poverty rates, and about a 1 percentage point difference in unemployment rates. And in particular, one thing I'm interested in is that there's been a lot of research looking at how child poverty, so children raised in poor households, how that affects academic achievement. And there appears to be quite a negative correlation, so that children growing up in poor households do poorly on academic measures compared with other students. And so I think this is a real challenge for low educations in rural areas that, how do you sort of break that cycle? It seems like children raised in these low education counties are going to face some struggles to getting a good education and doing well. We could go to the next slide. This is the final slide I have that I'll share with you today. That this goes beyond economic measures and looks at population change. And this is also important for many rural counties. As we've heard in the intro, the past few years, rural places have lost population or held about steady overall in the country. And I'm so used to hearing that story that when I was looking at the numbers for the South, I was a little bit puzzled, and then I realized that the South actually, is benefiting from some demographic shifts in the country overall. So more people are moving out of the Great Plains and the Rust Belt and moving to the West and the South. So if you looked at this graph for the whole country rather than the South, you would see population loss in low education places. But in the South, it looks like on average, low educational counties are gaining some population, but it's about half, less than half the rate of all other metro counties in the South. And a lot of that population change appears to be driven by outmigration. So the next two bars again show what's happening in low education counties in the rural South and all other rural counties in the South. And this net migration figure tells you what's the number of people moving in minus the number of people moving out per 100 people. So it's a rate over a 10-year period. It really shows that low education counties in the South are facing people leaving relative to all other rural counties in the South. And with that, I think I'll finish to leave time for other people.
Thank you, Dr. Murray, for that informative presentation. And just so everyone knows, the presentations will be posted online as well with the webinar, so you can see the ones that he wasn't able to get to. And with that, we'll turn it over to Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you. First, thanks, Alex, for setting such a nice statistical snapshot of the rural South. Secondly, life goes on, but if we could just take a moment for the tragedies that happened in Charleston yesterday, which I know is a southern city, so our hearts go out to that. Life moves on. So the first slide you see here is education as a tool. I'd already want to change that and say education is a platform for economic development in rural areas. The school can be the major community identity. It's often the largest employer, often the highest paid and highest educated folks are the school people. It can be a site for economic revitalization and adult learning. And so education, particularly in rural communities, is much more than a tool. It's a platform for learning, living, and livelihood. Next slide. So quickly today we're going to go over and kind of talk about a big 20,000-foot perspective on what are the various rural prosperity dynamics. And essentially that's looking at community development, educational development, and economic development. Three areas that sometimes are looked at as silos. What we try to do with Patel for Kids and our rural collaboratives around the country is bring them together. We'll talk briefly about the rural policy perspective, how we shape rural policy now and how we might shape it in the future. We'll talk about maybe rewriting some rural education rules to give schools a fighting chance to mitigate poverty and be a vital source for economic revitalization. And we'll talk about one example of a place that's doing this, the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, which is the 21 districts in Southeast Ohio that was mentioned earlier. Next slide. The two slides you have following, you can look at your own leisure, but what they have here is we've kind of looked at the key dynamics of what's happening in community development, from boomers to intergenerational clashes, to the brain drain across the board, to the educational changes, to the economic changes. And the main reason we have these two slides is to say that a siloed or piecemeal approach to rural educational growth and prosperity needs to take more of a comprehensive, integrated approach. Most states really do not have comprehensive or conscious rural education and economic development policies, and we're trying to work in several states, including Tennessee and Kentucky in the South, to try to provide a more integrated approach. The one I would like to highlight there is the second row. So in many places in community development, as you know, globalization has shifted the jobs and closed down many industries and moved away from that kind of place-based identity. And if you go to the middle column, 17% of rural people receive any kind of post-secondary value, of a labor market value with a post-secondary credential. And then the third point, as Alex kind of said, and one of the things we didn't talk about, while there's brain drain, there are a lot of competent stayers that have a high school graduate degree. And self-employment and middle skills are hugely important. So in the places we're looking at ways that we can develop middle school skills and have the stayers have a better chance of self-employment and stay in the area. Move to the next slide, please. Well, again, similar barriers. One I'd like to bring up is the second from the bottom, the row second from the bottom. We're seeing some pretty good gains in working with school districts around entrepreneurial education and growing local businesses. And so, but there are barriers to do that in terms of amenities, how the schools can help really develop that. And one of the key things we've seen is when rural areas can create value chains and supply chains with their urban counterparts, whether that be in organic farming and creating yogurt places in urban cities and developing the value chain like Snowville Creamery has done in Southeast Ohio, but really trying to increase those urban-rural value chains and economic chains and really growing entrepreneurial talent in the rural areas, but building the supply chain so that they can stay in those areas. Next slide. So we were just in Colorado, and one of the Colorado leaders shared this poignant piece of art, Rural Hearts Are Bleeding. And I think for 30, 40 years, we kind of have rural as a compensatory policy where we tried to not really level the playing field, but we tried to provide enough resources to keep rural areas going. And what we're trying to do in Colorado and Kentucky and Ohio and Tennessee is to try to move from a policy of compensation to a policy of investment. So next slide, please. If there's any slide anybody on this conference call would pay attention to, it would be this slide. On the left-hand side are 7 areas that have done research on how you turn around rural economic areas using education. What we've done in the Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, we've done several studies, and on our website, www.patelforkids.org, you can get those reports. Second one is very interesting, comes from an education economist named Marguerite Rosa out of the University of Washington. She studied all the school districts in America, including all the states in the South. And she asked a very simple question. Which districts in the state do well on state and federal achievement tests, and which do it at a per pupil expenditure level that is very, very productive and efficient? And not surprisingly, probably the people on this call, in almost every state, the super high ROI are the rurals. They're able to do more with less. They have pretty good high school graduation rates. They do a really good job of many of them do a really good job of human capital dispersion and use of facilities and resources and materials. And so her research talks about what do those districts do that are different. We did here at Bethel for Kids about 3 years ago. We studied the persistent PISA performers around the world, Hong Kong, Singapore, Finland, and Ontario, Canada. And we looked at what they were doing, particularly in the rural areas. The National Rural Funders Collaborative, which was here for 10 years from about 2003 to 2012-13, and took a national approach to trying to bring philanthropic dollars together. They closed up their shop in 2012, but they did a really nice study on the rural areas that turned themselves around. Then there's a Rural Prosperity Index, which comes out of Northern Illinois University by the late Professor Eiserman. 40 years of studies on counties around the country and which counties do well and which counties don't do well and why. Then out of the Rupri Institute, looking at rural turnaround research, rural counties that have turned themselves around educationally and economically. And then finally, Rupri has also done boomtown research, particularly energy boomtowns, and looked at rural energy boomtowns that lasted outside the energy boom and were able to have sustainable prosperity. Why we pulled all those together is because of the right side. Not that there's a magic bullet or a formula here, but all of those on the left side agree to the 7 policy of investment on the right side. And so state or federal resources helping the rural folks identify their strengths, their weaknesses, their leadership needs, and there's no substitute for self-discovery. And what often will happen in policy is people won't pay for that. And if you really look at all the research, areas that really focus on collaborative research, that have a laser-like focus on education, economic development, and have resources to build the leadership, can really turn themselves around. Secondly, schools are at the center of community identity and destiny. All 7 reports talked about that and the importance of making schools the center of economic development, which means extending the school day, which means opening up the schools to adult learners and to community development projects, which will include, we've seen in places on school grounds, having gardens, community gardens and stuff like that. In rural areas, Alex said earlier, and I know he didn't mean it, but you know, he used the frame that rurals are the residual. That's what often happens in rural policy. And the policy for most rural areas that I've ever been in is strong relationships. And so what we can do is develop strong relationships between community, economic, and educational leaders, both formal and non-formal, are really important. Resources, whether they be shared services, having one group cut the lawn for the community county building as well as the school building, as well as the high school, as well as the local community. But resources must be shared. Ingenuity drives decisions. Data is important, but the capacity to really think outside the box and think of different ways to get more bang for your buck. 6th one, which can sometimes be overlooked in recent years, race, class, and power still really matter. In many rural areas, as they're moving to diversity, they need help in dealing with the shift in power structures and race structures that take place. And finally, family economic success is the bottom line. We've seen in too many places, as Alex was talking about with the brain drain, where kids leave and they don't come back and they take that income, but often many of them come back with the college debt and it puts the family in a worse setting. So how schools can deal with family economic success is important. Next slide. One of the key things for policymakers to realize is that the policies that we've established in this country for educational reform in the last 10 or 15 years are not always rural ready, are not always specific, and I'll just give you a couple examples. In accountability dilemmas, while there are huge issues of achievement gaps and graduation rates in many urban areas, a lot of rural places do a fairly good job on graduation rates and on achievement gaps. Their issues are attainment gaps and opportunity gaps, giving kids access to concurrent enrollment or dual enrollment. And so having accountability policies that would incentivize rural areas to focus more on the gaps that really matter to their economic success would be important. Policy overload and overlooked dilemmas. We all know that many of the federal competitions are not very rural-centric. While they try to do a better job in the last few years with I-3 and Race to the Top district, there still is not really a great focus on rural competitions. And often the reporting mechanisms for the compliance issues of federal and state policies make one-person or three-person central office shops in rural districts very difficult. Capacity building dilemmas. You often have singleton teachers in the district, and so how do you really build physics capacity or STEM capacity when you have 1, 2 teachers, perhaps in your entire district for those kind of things? And then sustainability dilemmas. Once you run out of the federal or state grant, how do you actually keep the good programs? Finally, an example of a place that we're trying to do that, as mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. The Ohio Appalachian Collaborative, just quickly. What we've done there is connect the 9 institutions of higher education in the Southeast region with 21 progressive school districts, with their mayors, community commissioners, philanthropic organizations like the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio, and align the self-interest around how can we create and keep more wealth, particularly in an area that's going under a Marcellus Utica shale play energy boom. How can we make sure the school identity is a community identity and give the school the chance through entrepreneurial education or whatever to be the center of community development. Synchronize the assets. So what we've done in the last 4 years, we've now grown to 27 districts. We've added a couple of regional service centers serving 48,000 students. To give you a sense of that, that would put us on a par if we were considered one school district. It's the largest school district in the state of Ohio with Cincinnati and Columbus. What we've essentially done is developed a dual enrollment system that allows for all the kids in all those 27 districts to connect through long-distance learning and almost a virtual regional community college to get into dual enrollment programming that ties to local job creation, to local economic assets. Finally, early returns is $3.6 million in annual cost savings. We've been able to leverage necessary human social capital by bringing in those singleton teachers together. We've doubled the percentage of young Appalachians with post-secondary credential holding labor market value. And all of this has been done in a cost-neutral innovation because we've been able to reduce remediation costs and credit recovery expenses to pave the way. So I would say an innovative state policy that Ohio has done, the Straight A Innovation Fund has been hugely important. Quick thing on the Straight A Innovation Fund, it's a statewide competition with a rural focus for one category to really provide incentive dollars to do this kind of innovative cross-agency, cross-community, cross-district economic and education development approach. Last page, please. If you want to learn more, you can email me directly or you can go to our website at patelforkids.org. Sorry I took so much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, and certainly we're learning, so timing is a little concern. And so now we will go to our last presenters, and they will be Mr. Jacobs and Dr. Dishner, so I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Drew Jacobs, and I serve as the Director of Data and Research for Tennessee SCORE, and I'm joined by Mary Cypress-Metz, who's SCORE's Director of Outreach. And I'm going to be relatively brief because I think the most important thing that we have to contribute is giving Dr. Dishner an opportunity to talk about the great work that's going on in the Niswonger region. But I will briefly talk a little bit about SCORE's work as it relates to rural education in rural communities across Tennessee. Next slide. So just briefly about SCORE. SCORE is the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, and we work to collaboratively support Tennessee's work to prepare students for college and the workforce. And at SCORE, we have two large goals. The first is that Tennessee is the fastest improving state in the nation. And the second is that every Tennessean graduates high school prepared for college and the workforce. Next slide. And I guess press the button again. There might be an animation in here. Great. So SCORE's work is governed by a theory of change, and the four things that we're focused on here are embracing high academic standards, cultivating strong school and district leadership, ensuring excellent teaching in every classroom, and using data to enhance student learning. And obviously, as we think about rural education, these issues are important to all communities. They're important to urban, suburban, and rural schools. And so I'll talk a little bit here in a moment about some of the ways that we work to bring rural perspectives to bear on these topics in our work. Next slide. So every year, SCORE, in conjunction with its partners, again, collaborative is in our name, and so it's the fiber by which we do all of our work. Each year, our organization consults with our steering committee, our board of directors, and practitioners across all communities in Tennessee to develop what we call the State of Education in Tennessee report. And every year we work to develop education priorities for the state of Tennessee, not just for SCORE, but for all partners. So for State Department of Education, for folks in schools and districts across Tennessee, for business leaders, for a wide range of people who are interested in education. And to form this report, we have conversations, interviews, and collect a lot of both quantitative and qualitative data that helps us to land on the key priorities for the coming year. For 2015, these priorities were focusing on selecting and implementing high-quality assessments, ensuring improved and continued implementation of high academic standards in Tennessee, elevating the teaching profession in Tennessee, and working towards improvements in school leadership. And all of these priorities were informed in large part by folks in rural communities across Tennessee. Next slide. So talking now a little bit about some of SCORE's specific work as it relates to rural communities. And there are really kind of two big buckets that we'll talk about. And then at the end, we'll close out by talking a little bit about how we engage rural communities just kind of in our day-to-day work. So back in 2011, SCORE convened a wide range of stakeholders for a rural education summit. And the product of this summit was this report that you see here on your screen, which is called Transforming the Rural South, a Roadmap to Improving Rural Education. And so based upon the research and the conversations that were had at this summit in 2011, SCORE produced this brief pamphlet. And it contains 34 action items for education stakeholders. Again, you know, a wide range of folks, policymakers, folks in schools and school districts, business and community leaders, et cetera. And the items in this report are categorized into 6 areas, and you know, the previous 2 presenters talked a lot about some of these areas, and so I'll share those with you now. Next slide. So the top priorities from the Rural Roadmap include highlighting the connection between education and economic development. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about that today. Offering schools and school districts more flexibility. Again, heard a little bit about kind of the unique rural context today. Forming a pipeline of effective teachers, and I would probably add to that leaders as well. Our organization has done a lot of work on trying to understand directly from folks in rural communities what the particular needs are related to teaching and to school leadership. And we've been working hard to advocate for policies that support the formation of an effective pipeline over the past several years. Utilizing technology to meet instructional needs, creating professional learning communities for administrators, and forming community partnerships to enhance educational opportunities. I'm so excited that Dr. Dishner is here with us today because the work that's going on in Northeast Tennessee is just such a great example of the ways in which rural communities can come together to achieve many goals in education and get and work towards closing some of the gaps that the previous presenters talked about related to attainment and to opportunity. Next slide. In addition to the Rural Roadmap, SCORE has also historically engaged rural education partners in our Rural Education Network. And again, one of the things that our organization does is serve as a collaborator and a convener amongst many different partners in education, business, philanthropy, et cetera, across Tennessee. And so historically, our Rural Education Network has come together to provide our organization with policy direction, to lend their expertise on effective rural education practices, and to help us share and spread best practices from rural communities with other folks across Tennessee. Next slide. But as we've done our work at Tennessee SCORE, we really are engaged with rural communities in our day-to-day work. It's something that's very important to us, as Tennessee is a predominantly rural state, if we recall the maps that we saw a few moments ago. And so these might seem like kind of straightforward things, but they're some of the ways that our organization works to engage in rural communities on a day-to-day basis. So the first is that we have strong membership on our steering committee and board of directors from rural communities. So top leaders from these communities are engaged with us and help set the direction of our organization. Second, every year our organization has an effort where we recognize the top performing schools and school districts across the state of Tennessee. What's very interesting is that in many instances these are rural communities, and they're rural schools and school districts that are some of Tennessee's best schools and school districts. And so what we do is we recognize these schools and school districts through our SCORE Prize, and we work with these schools and districts to really understand what are the policies and practices that they have in place that are getting such great results for students. Recently, just to give you all a couple of examples, right now we've got a blog series going on our Tennessee SCORE blog, which we share with a variety of stakeholders. And there are 2 blogs in particular that have been published that highlight the work of rural schools and school districts. One is a high school in rural West Tennessee that has partnered with Unilever, which is an industry in their community, and it's a blog talking a lot about the partnerships that school has built with folks in their community. And another is some of the great leadership work that's going on in Upper East Tennessee, one of the districts that Dr. Dishner works with in her work. In In addition, we engage rural communities in lots of different ways in our advocacy work, and I'll let Mary Cypress jump in here as well. But we invite rural education and business leaders to our events and panels. We engage rural educators in our Educator Fellows program, which is a program that's designed to amplify teacher voice in public policy conversations. And we really work hard to have rural educators engaged at the legislature. Anything else that you might add, Mary Cypress?
I would just add that, as Drew mentioned before, we are a convener. That's what we see the role SCORE plays in our state, and we are always thinking about how the rural community can be a part of every conversation. Drew kind of touched on this earlier, but in the past maybe the rural conversation was different, but now it's really tied into everything we do and making sure that voice is represented and that we're reaching those communities as well. And so there are a lot of different topics that we like to share information on throughout the state, and making sure we're hitting the rural communities and building relationships with leaders in rural communities to share good information with them in a way that will reach community members. And as Drew mentioned, the Educator Fellows, we see that group as a very diverse group of teachers from across the state, and the rural voice is extremely represented, and helps for stakeholders across the state that SCORE brings together to really hear from rural teachers what's happening in their districts.
Great, and with that, I'd love to pass it over to Dr. Dishner, one of our very valued partners and just a great person in general, to talk a little bit about the work that the Niswonger Foundation is doing in Northeast Tennessee.
Thank you, Drew. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion. I know that I probably only have a few moments left to speak, so I will try to move as quickly as possible. The Niswonger Foundation's mission is to create opportunities for individual and community growth through education and other sustainable projects. And we'll fast forward. The reason for our mission really is fundamental to this discussion today, because this is a report that came from Rural Schools and Community Trust on why rural matters. But it talks about students who are living in poverty, and this was very informative to me because it shares that students who are living in rural areas really are at a greater disadvantage if they are living in poverty than those in urban and suburban settings, and that they are struggling with reading in earlier grades far greater than children who are living in urban settings, and that they drop out of school at a greater rate. And we also know that it is more difficult in rural schools to keep those highly qualified teachers we need to really help our students to be successful. Next slide. So in our area, we find some of these fundamental problems as well. Disparities in our region include the highest rate of unemployment in Tennessee, the largest user of prescription drugs, the highest rate of babies being born drug dependent, the highest rate of obesity in our state. We are still considerably first-generation students attending college. Next slide. So Scott Niswonger's vision was really to look at the fact that communities grow and develop through three means. This is no surprise. It's just that he's put a lot of work and effort into this task. He is a regional business leader and a philanthropist who does not have a background in education himself, but when he was identifying individuals to work in his businesses, what he was finding was commonly on their resume they would have that they were the valedictorian of their high school, but in fact they had an ACT score of 18. And so he realized that there were some disparities in what was happening in the school settings in Northeast Tennessee, and decided that education was where he wanted to put a lot of focus and attention. We'll go on to the next slide. So he built a model where he uses resources from his for-profit company, funnels them into the Niswonger Foundation, where we can use them for educational development. So we're an operating foundation. We really do not have to seek additional grant support, but found that to be advantageous to take some opportunities to do that in some powerful ways. So First and foremost, he looks at education and what we can do to impact that. But when you see the venture capital piece, that's really his piece of economic development. Mr. Niswonger spends a considerable portion of his time recruiting business and industry to our region, and also has an angel capital fund of his own that he uses to help to start new business. Quality of life is the health piece. He's very engaged with the work with the hospitals in our region, particularly with the development of his own Niswonger Children's Hospital, which is the only children's hospital in our region. But the idea is, if we're going to be successful in school, we have to be healthy. If we're going to be employed, we're going to have to be healthy and well educated. Next slide. We have two major programs at our foundation, and one is our Scholarship and Leadership Program, and this speaks to the brain drain we've been hearing in the conversation during this webinar. We are selecting and training and educating a next generation of leaderships for our region through our Scholarship and Leadership Program. Our Niswonger Scholars Program provides a full ride scholarship to the college or university of the student's choice anywhere in the U.S. to a specially selected group of students from seniors in high school who have shown themselves to be servant leaders, prepared to serve the community. We provide them a comprehensive leadership development program through their college experience, and we'll provide support for study abroad, internships, etc., personal counseling, career advice, whatever they need. And in exchange for that, these students are signing a contract to return to Northeast Tennessee to live, work, and serve. We already have 77 students who are Niswonger scholars that are either in the program or have graduated on our alumni of the program, already beginning to serve our region. Next slide. The other aspect of our work is our school partnership programs. That's our K-12 educational programs where we're affecting change in Northeast Tennessee through rigorous, relevant, and cost-effective programs identified with our school system partners. They're telling us what they need to improve and to grow, and we're providing the support that they need. We always work in partnership, and when we leave a partnership, we leave it sustainable. Next slide. So 5 years ago, we were in the first cohort to apply for and to receive an I3 Investing in Innovation grant, thanks in large measure to the partnership support from SCORE. With this, we have been able to really focus attention on building a stronger college-going culture and an expectation among our students that they will go on to post-secondary education. Next slide. We'll show you the region that we're serving. So this is a 15 school system region that's working with us on our I3 grant. We have 7 higher education institutions within this framework that have been strong supporters of our work and our effort. And we are working with 30 high schools in this experience. This is a geographic area that covers about 3,500 square miles. So it is not only is it a large region from that perspective, but it is also geographically a very challenging region because of the mountainous climate. Next slide. The consortium impact I will go through very, very quickly, and then you can look at this in detail later. But basically our current situation is that we lag well behind the state and national averages on college and career readiness. And our mountains do protect us from a lot more than the weather. We have limited opportunities for sharing of knowledge and resources within our region. Our I3 grant strategies were really to increase course rigor and access, and how we hope to change that is with resource sharing, with scaling up best practices, improved communication, becoming a state and national voice for the cause of post-secondary and career readiness. And our intended impact is that all students in our region would have access to more rigorous and a broader range of courses, and increase the number of students who are graduating from high school prepared for college. Next slide. Our areas of focus with the grant are listed here for you. I would comment that the last one, distance learning, was where we had really started as a foundation in 2001 as we built an infrastructure to provide for distance learning across our mountains. And this was giving a chance for a student in a high school that has 40 students, literally, to a high school that may have 2,000 students, but it gave equal opportunity for the students to have some access to courses that they couldn't otherwise get. But what we learned from synchronous instruction is that there's a lot of issues with that across school systems. The grant has provided us the chance to look at this in a different way, a much more personalized learning approach through online learning. So we now have an online school with 45 courses, rigorous courses that include AP, science, math, English. It includes numerous foreign languages, an opportunity for students throughout our region to have online access to the most rigorous, best quality courses we can provide. We also have focused heavy attention on advanced placement. We, at the time the grant began, had very few high schools with advanced placement opportunity. Now all students in Northeast Tennessee high schools have opportunity to take advanced placement courses. And of the 30 high schools, there are on-ground courses in 29 of them. One of the high schools, the very smallest, has access through our online programs. We've also trained nearly 700 of our teachers, sending them to AP training. So we have a wonderful cadre of faculty who've improved their skills in teaching because of this effort. We have 9 college and career counselors who do nothing but counseling for our 30 high schools in preparing students to go on to college, helping them with college applications, filling out FAFSA, anything that they might need as far as campus visits, because these are, most of them are first generation, and families want to help, but they don't know how to help. Professional development has been a strong focus of our work. We have had a strong STEM focus, and also we have worked with our college partners to dramatically increase the dual enrollment opportunities for our students. Next slide. We know that we have to work now to sustain, and these are the 4 specific areas we have learned the most during this grant process, and the ones we do not want to lose. So while we have invested in 5 years $21 million into these practices, we know we can't do that going forward. But we have been able to, through our sustainability plan, determine exactly what needs to be sustained and systematically have worked to rearrange our funding, to find additional funding, to find additional sources to help us, and we will be able to sustain all 4 of these major areas of success from our grant. Next slide. These lessons learned I will leave you to read later, but simply to say these are the things that may seem intuitive as you read through them, but they've been very important to our process to learn. We've never lost sight of our mission. We have truly learned to listen to our stakeholders, and we know how important communicating with our school professionals is in moving forward. And we've just learned that we can figure out how to do anything we have to do in this process. Next slide. I know I had to go through mine extremely rapidly, but I want to share my contact information. This includes my mobile number. Please feel free to call me if I could be of help to you in any way, or share these resources in a little bit slower manner than I had to today. Thank you very much. And Miko and Lauren, thank you so much for providing us this opportunity.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dishner over at Niswonger. That was definitely some interesting presentation and some impressive work you're doing over there in Tennessee. And thank you again, Mr. Jacobs and Ms. Cypress over at SCORE. Unfortunately, we have run over our time slot for this webinar, so we don't have time for a question and answer session at this time. If someone in the audience does have questions, you can forward those to us or directly to the presenters. We are at www.slcatlanta.org. Again, Miko Lindberg and Lauren Greer. Also, you can call us at 404-633-1866 with your questions. Again, we want to thank our presenters for their time and very informative contributions. We'd also like to thank our CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her assistance with the technical aspects of this webinar. Again, all of these slides will be available online at the CSG Knowledge Center or at the slcatlanta.org website. And if there is anything more that the SLC can do to assist you in your work, please don't hesitate to contact us. With that, I hope you have enjoy the rest of your afternoon.